When we talk about avoidant attachment, we're not just discussing a dating pattern or some quirky personality trait. We're talking about a deep-rooted psychological framework that often stems from early childhood experiences. Moments when love and safety were inconsistent, when vulnerability was met with rejection, or when independence was praised as the only way to survive. That wiring stays with people. So when you enter their life, even if you bring love, security, and consistency, their instinctive response is often to withdraw, to put up walls, because closeness feels dangerous. To them, intimacy doesn't represent comfort. It represents risk. And that's what makes the avoidant mindset so confusing for people who care deeply. Because when you lean in, when you try to love them more, reassure them, or prove your loyalty, it triggers the very thing they're wired to resist. They don't feel closer, they feel suffocated. It's not that they don't value connection. It's that connection exposes them to old wounds, old fears of being let down. So they create space. They shut down emotionally. They convince themselves they don't need the relationship, even if it's the very thing they secretly long for. Now here's the paradox: the moment you stop caring, or at least the moment you stop actively pursuing them, something flips. It's not magic, it's psychology. When you no longer feed into the dynamic of chase and retreat, the avoidant suddenly feels the emptiness of your absence. And because control is such a big part of their defense mechanism, the fact that they're no longer in control unsettles them. They start to feel drawn back in, not necessarily out of a conscious choice, but because the very thing they've been running from, closeness, starts to feel safer when it's no longer demanded from them. This is why so many people say, "The moment I stopped texting him, he started texting me." Or, "The minute I stopped begging her to open up, she started calling me again." It's not coincidence. It's the psychology of avoidance meeting the reality of loss. What they couldn't appreciate when it was in front of them, they start to notice once it's gone. And here's the philosophical truth buried underneath all of this sometimes. We don't value freedom until we lose the safety net of connection. The avoidant may believe they thrive in independence, but that belief is tested when independence stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like loneliness. But let's be very clear, their chasing doesn't necessarily mean they've changed or that the relationship dynamic is suddenly healthy. Often, it's less about genuine transformation and more about anxiety being triggered. They feel the balance of power shifting. They realize that the thing they thought they could take for granted, you showing up no matter what, might not be guaranteed anymore. And that realization forces them into action. They chase because losing you highlights their vulnerability, even if they don't fully admit it to themselves. What does this mean for you? It means you need to stop making their avoidance about your worth. Because the truth is, their attachment style was formed long before you ever showed up. Their distancing is not evidence that you're unlovable. It's evidence of how much they fear love. When you understand that, you stop internalizing their behavior as rejection and start seeing it as a reflection of their unfinished business. That shift alone is powerful because it allows you to stand in your own value instead of shrinking every time they pull away. And the irony is, that's the very moment when the dynamic changes. When you no longer bend, twist, or chase to get their attention, you break the cycle. You reclaim your own energy, your self-respect, your independence. And that energy is magnetic, not just to them, but to anyone who's truly capable of appreciating it. So yes, when an avoidant realizes you don't care anymore, they often start chasing. But the real question is, Do you actually want to be chased by someone who only values you when they're afraid of losing you? Or do you want to be chosen by someone who values you from the start? Here's the reflection I'll leave you with. You can't heal someone else's fear of intimacy by sacrificing your own peace. The only way to shift the dynamic is to reclaim your power, step back, and let their actions reveal the truth. And once you see that truth, it's up to you to decide whether their chase is worth your heart. Detachment is one of the most misunderstood concepts when it comes to relationships, especially with someone who has an avoidant attachment style. People hear the word detachment and think it means indifference, coldness, or giving up. But in reality, healthy detachment isn't about shutting down emotionally. It's about reclaiming your center. It's about refusing to let your peace, your self-worth, or your sense of identity hinge entirely on how another person behaves toward you. And when you embody that kind of detachment, it changes everything. See, in an avoidant dynamic, what usually happens is this one person leans in harder and harder, trying to close the gap, but while the avoidant leans further and further away. That creates an exhausting imbalance where one person is constantly overfunctioning and the other is underfunctioning. The pursuer thinks, if I just prove how much I care, they'll finally feel safe. But the avoidant doesn't experience it that way. To them, the pursuit feels like pressure. It feels like someone trying to dismantle their defenses, which makes them dig in even deeper. Detachment disrupts this loop. When you stop trying to force closeness, you remove the very pressure that fuels their retreat. You say, without words, I'm no longer willing to carry this entire connection on my back. And that shift doesn't just affect them, it affects you. Because suddenly, you're no longer performing emotional gymnastics to hold someone else's attention. You're free to redirect all of that energy back into yourself, into your own growth, into your own sense of fulfillment. Now here's where it gets interesting. Avoidant individuals often don't notice the weight of someone's presence until that weight is gone. While you were constantly there, offering reassurance, texting first, smoothing over conflicts, they could afford to remain disengaged. But when you step back, when you detach with calm, not anger, they feel the silence. They notice the absence. The very thing they believed they didn't need starts to matter, precisely because it's no longer guaranteed. But detachment isn't a game. It's not about manipulating someone into chasing you. It's not the silent treatment, and it's not passive aggression. It's a conscious decision to stop investing where you're not being equally met. And that decision requires courage because it means you have to be okay with whatever their reaction is. Sometimes they chase. Sometimes they don't. But either way, you've chosen yourself. Philosophically, this is the essence of what the Stoics talked about centuries ago, the idea that we can't control another person's actions, only our response to them. Detachment isn't about control, it's about freedom. You stop living at the mercy of someone else's hot and cold behavior and start anchoring yourself in your own stability. And ironically, it's that stability that often makes the avoidant reconsider. Because when you no longer make them the center of your emotional universe, you suddenly become more attractive, more grounded, more real. I want to emphasize something here. Detachment doesn't mean you don't care. It means you stop trying to convince someone else to care. It means you recognize that love, trust, and connection can't be begged for. They have to be freely given. And when you internalize that truth, you stop waiting anxiously for their validation and start focusing on whether the relationship is even worth your time and energy. That's a radical shift, and it's one that puts the power back in your hands. Think about how much energy you've poured into holding on. Think about how many hours you've spent analyzing texts, trying to decode silences, rehearsing conversations in your head. Now imagine redirecting that energy into your own growth, your passions, your goals, your friendships, your health. Imagine how magnetic you'd feel if you weren't constantly living on edge, wondering if someone else was going to meet you halfway. That's the gift of detachment. It liberates you from the cycle of waiting and worrying, and it allows you to come back to yourself. And here's the paradox. When you detach, the avoidant often returns. They start to chase, not because you manipulated them, but because your absence woke them up. But the real win isn't in their chase. The real win is that you're no longer lost in the exhausting pursuit of someone who couldn't meet you. You've found yourself again. So here's the thought I want to leave you with. If you spend your life chasing someone else's love, you'll always feel empty. But when you detach, you stop running. You stand still in your own strength, and you let others reveal who they are when they can no longer rely on you to do all the work. And once you see who they are without your effort holding the relationship together, you gain the clarity to choose whether they're worth chasing at all. Desire doesn't live in constant closeness. Desire lives in space. That might sound counterintuitive because we've been conditioned to believe that if we just stay available, if we stay close, if we give someone everything they want, they'll value us more. But human psychology doesn't work that way, especially for someone with an avoidant attachment style. When there's no distance, there's no room for longing, and longing is what creates desire. This is why, when you stop caring, at least outwardly, the dynamic flips. Avoidants are used to being the ones who set the pace, the ones who retreat and create distance. They control how close or far the relationship feels. But when you stop chasing, you take that control away from them. Suddenly, they're the ones on the outside, looking in, wondering what changed. And because human beings are wired to notice what's missing more than what's present, they start to feel the absence of your attention more acutely than they ever appreciated your presence. Think about it in everyday terms. When you have constant access to something, you stop noticing it. You don't marvel at the electricity in your home until the power goes out. You don't think about clean water until it stops running from the faucet. You don't appreciate someone checking in daily until their silence makes you wonder where they've gone. That gap between expectation and reality creates desire. It's the contrast that makes us pay attention. For avoidance, this effect is even more powerful because their defense mechanism is built on the illusion of independence. They tell themselves, I don't need anyone. I'm fine on my own. But that illusion only works when someone is still there, orbiting around them, quietly providing a sense of stability they don't consciously acknowledge. The minute you stop orbiting, the illusion cracks. Independence suddenly feels like isolation. And isolation, no matter how much they claim to crave it, is not sustainable. Now, I want to pause here and make an important distinction. Creating distance isn't about manipulation. It's not about pulling back just to get a reaction. It's about reclaiming your energy and letting reality do the work. You're not punishing them with silence. You're simply no longer overextending yourself. And in that gap, their psychology takes over. They begin to feel the weight of your absence, and for the first time, they recognize the value of what they had. Philosophically, this speaks to a larger truth about human nature. We are drawn not just to what is given freely, but to what can be lost. The value of anything increases when it's scarce. That's why people line up for limited, edition sneakers, or spend thousands on rare art. It's not just the object. It's the scarcity that creates urgency. In relationships, the same principle applies. When your energy, your love, your attention is always available, it loses its perceived value. When you create space, suddenly it becomes rare, and rarity sparks desire. But here's the deeper layer. It's not really about making them desire you. It's about making yourself unavailable to unhealthy dynamics. It's about saying, I will no longer pour all of my love into a one-sided connection. And when you live from that place, you naturally create distance, not out of strategy, but out of self-respect. That self-respect radiates, and it's magnetic. You don't have to perform or pretend. You just stand in your truth, and that truth is powerful enough to draw people in. Now, let's be real, not every avoidant will suddenly transform because you created space. Some will notice the distance, panic for a moment, and then retreat even further because they're not ready to face their own fears. Others will start chasing, realizing they miss what they took for granted. But either way, the outcome serves you. If they retreat, you gain clarity. If they chase, you gain confirmation of your worth. In both cases, you've broken the cycle of pursuit. And maybe this is the hardest part for many people to accept. Your goal isn't to make the avoidant desire you. Your goal is to create a dynamic where desire has room to exist at all. Constant pursuit kills desire. Constant availability suffocates it. Space, healthy, intentional space, is what allows desire to breathe. So the next time you feel tempted to close the gap, to send one more text, to push one more conversation, I want you to remember this. Every time you rush into the space, you take away the very oxygen that desire needs to ignite. If you want someone to chase, you have to be willing to step back far enough for them to feel the pull. Here's the reflection I'll leave you with. Closeness without space is comfort, but comfort without desire becomes complacency. If you want to be truly valued, you must be willing to let your absence speak louder than your constant presence. Power is always present in relationships, whether we like to acknowledge it or not. It shows up in who sets the tone, who makes the decisions, and who dictates how close or distant the connection feels. With avoidant partners, the balance of power usually leans in their direction because they control intimacy through withdrawal. Every time they pull back, the other person scrambles to close the gap, and without realizing it, the pursuer hands over their power, hoping that if they try hard enough, the avoidant will finally stay close. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Chasing someone who thrives on distance doesn't create closeness. It creates control. They set the rhythm, and you dance to it. And the more you chase, the more you reinforce the dynamic that says, your love matters more than my peace. Your approval matters more than my dignity. It's not that you consciously choose to give up your power. It happens subtly, little by little, every time you make excuses for their silence, every time you overextend yourself to hold the connection together. The shift happens the moment you stop playing that role. When you step back and reclaim your focus, the balance of power begins to level out. Not because you're trying to dominate, but because you're no longer surrendering your energy to a game that was never yours to win. This is the essence of empowerment in relationships, refusing to let someone else's fear of intimacy dictate your sense of worth. Now, let's get into the psychology of why this matters so much. Avoidants are deeply uncomfortable with vulnerability. By controlling closeness through withdrawal, they protect themselves from the discomfort of feeling dependent on someone else. When you chase them, you confirm their narrative that intimacy equals suffocation, that connection equals loss of independence. But when you stop, When you calmly reclaim your own space, you flip that script. Suddenly, but they're not the ones in control anymore. They're forced to confront the reality that connection requires reciprocity. And here's what's fascinating. When you no longer hand them all the power, most avoidants begin to feel a shift they didn't expect. At first, it might look like confusion or even resistance. But beneath that, there's a subtle awareness creeping in. The awareness that they can't keep the relationship alive by pulling away. That awareness often sparks pursuit, not because they've suddenly healed all their wounds, but because the balance of power has changed. They're no longer the unquestioned center of the dynamic, and that unsettles them enough to take action. Philosophically, this ties into a much bigger truth about human nature. Relationships are never static. They're a constant negotiation of energy, attention, and effort. And whenever one person takes on more than their share, the other person learns to do less. It's not malicious, it's human. We gravitate toward the path of least resistance. If you're willing to carry the relationship, the avoidant will let you. If you stop carrying it, they're forced to decide whether it matters enough to them to step in. This is where your growth comes in, because the real point of reclaiming your power isn't to make them chase you. It's to free yourself from a cycle that leaves you drained and disempowered. When you take your energy back, you stop waiting for crumbs and start demanding a seat at the table. And even if they do come chasing, you now have the clarity to ask, is this enough? Do their actions actually align with the kind of relationship I want? That clarity only comes when you stop giving them the entire deck to play with. Think about how different your life feels when you operate from that place. Instead of sending texts laced with hidden desperation, you send messages when you want to, not when you're scared of losing someone. Instead of rearranging your schedule to fit into their world, you start prioritizing your own. Instead of reading into silences as signs of rejection, you see them as information. Information about whether this person has the capacity to truly meet you. That's power. Not control over someone else, but control over yourself. And here's the paradox: the moment you stop surrendering your power is the moment they feel compelled to step closer. Why? Because power isn't attractive when it's handed over. It's attractive when it's embodied. The person who stands tall in their independence, who refuses to sacrifice their peace for attention, that's the person who naturally draws others in. That's the person who commands respect without demanding it. So the next time you find yourself waiting, overanalyzing, wondering what their silence means, remember this: you don't have to keep dancing to a rhythm that doesn't serve you. You can stop. You can step back. You can reclaim your balance. And when you do, the entire dynamic shifts, not just with them, but with everyone you encounter. Here's the reflection I'll leave you with. Power in relationships isn't about control over someone else. It's about refusing to lose yourself. The moment you remember that, you stop chasing people who run and start attracting people who stay. One of the most powerful shifts you can ever make in this dynamic is choosing to prioritize yourself. And I don't mean that in a cliché self-love Instagram post kind of way. I mean truly redirecting the energy you've been pouring into an avoidant person back into your own growth, your own healing, your own life. Because here's the truth: when you stop making their emotional availability, or lack of it, the center of your world, you begin to transform in ways that not only free you, but also change how others see you. Avoidants are used to being the focal point. They're used to someone orbiting around their moods, their silences, their half-hearted efforts. But when you shift your focus from them to yourself, You stop feeding that cycle. You stop being the emotional caretaker of the relationship and instead become the caretaker of your own life. That shift is magnetic. And it's not magnetic because you're trying to make them chase. It's magnetic because people can feel when someone is grounded in their own worth. Think about the energy you carry when you're chasing someone who keeps pulling away. Your body language tightens. Your tone carries an edge of desperation. Even if you're trying to play it cool, underneath there's this anxious hum of, please notice me. Please choose me. And that energy doesn't feel strong. It doesn't feel attractive. It feels needy. But the moment you pull that energy back and start focusing on your own goals, your own joy, your own peace, something changes in you. You walk differently. You speak differently. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop asking questions that are really just disguised pleas for reassurance. And that kind of grounded presence is impossible to ignore. Psychologically, this works because humans are drawn to confidence and autonomy. We're wired to admire people who stand firmly in who they are, even when circumstances are uncertain. And the moment you stop revolving around someone else's avoidance, you start to embody that strength. That's when they notice. That's when the avoidant starts to realize that you're no longer holding them as the center of your universe. And that realization can trigger them to chase. But again, let me stress this, the goal isn't to make them chase. The goal is to find yourself again. Because when you've been caught in this cycle long enough, you forget what it feels like to wake up excited about your own life. You forget what it feels like to be lit up by your own passions instead of drained by someone else's ambivalence. The chase, if it happens, is just a byproduct of your transformation. The real prize is you, your strength, your clarity, your independence. Philosophically, this ties into one of the most profound truths of human existence. We can't control whether someone loves us, but we can always control whether we are living as someone we respect. And the moment you live in alignment with your own values, you shift from needing to be chosen to choosing yourself. That shift doesn't just change your relationships. It changes your entire life. When you prioritize yourself, you begin to attract different energy altogether. Not just from the avoidant, but from the world. People who once overlooked you start paying attention. Opportunities that felt out of reach start showing up, because self-priority isn't selfish, it's expansive. It creates space for you to grow, and growth is magnetic. And here's the irony. This is often the exact moment when the avoidant wakes up. They see you no longer waiting, no longer chasing, no longer bending yourself to fit into their world. They see you rising. And in that rising, they feel something they hadn't felt before. Fear. Fear that they might actually lose you. That fear pushes them to chase. But whether or not they do isn't the point. The point is that you've stopped living in reaction to their choices. You've started living in alignment with your own. So let me ask you, what could you create if you redirected all the energy you've wasted on chasing into yourself? What goals could you accomplish? What passions could you rediscover? But what kind of life could you build if your focus was no longer trapped in the cycle of pursuit? That's the invitation. To stop pouring into a void and start pouring into your own becoming. Here's the reflection I'll leave you with. The strongest version of you doesn't chase anyone. The strongest version of you builds a life so full, so grounded, so magnetic, that anyone who wants to be part of it has to rise to meet you there. When an avoidant finally starts chasing, it can feel like a victory. After all those months, maybe even years, of trying to close the gap, suddenly they're the ones calling, texting, checking in. And if you've been starved for their attention, it's easy to mistake that shift for real change. But here's where clarity is everything. Because just because someone chases doesn't mean they're ready to commit. Chasing is often driven by fear, not love. It's fueled by the anxiety of losing control, the discomfort of realizing that the person they thought would always be there no longer is. And this is where so many people get pulled back into the cycle. They see pursuit as proof of transformation. They think, finally, they understand. Finally, they want me. But chasing isn't the same as choosing. Choosing is intentional. Choosing is consistent. Choosing means showing up not just when they feel you slipping away, but every single day, even when it's uncomfortable. That's why you need to step back and ask yourself, what are they really offering me now that they're chasing? Is it genuine growth? Or is it just a temporary reaction to fear? Because fear fades. And once their fear of losing you subsides, if they haven't actually done the work to face their avoidance, they'll fall right back into old patterns. That's the danger of mistaking pursuit for permanence. Clarity is about asking better questions. Not, do they want me? But, can they sustain the kind of relationship I want? Not, are they chasing? But, are they capable of choosing me when it's not convenient? When you frame it this way, you shift the power back where it belongs, with you. You stop being hypnotized by the sudden rush of attention and start evaluating whether this attention has the depth to actually last. And here's the philosophical truth behind it. Real love isn't reactive, it's proactive. Real love doesn't wake up only when threatened. Real love shows up because it chooses to over and over again. If the only time someone values you is when they're afraid of losing you, that's not love. That's insecurity. And insecurity cannot sustain a healthy relationship. So when they come chasing, and many of them will, your job is not to get swept up in the thrill of being pursued. Your job is to slow down, to observe, to watch whether their actions match their words, to see if their pursuit evolves into consistency, or if it fizzles the moment they feel secure again. This is where your boundaries matter more than ever. Because without boundaries, you'll find yourself right back in the cycle of functioning while they underfunction, hoping once again that they'll change. But here's the empowering part. Once you've reclaimed your energy, once you've learned to prioritize yourself, once you've understood how desire is born from space, you're no longer desperate for their chase. You might appreciate it, you might notice it, but you don't need it. And that's where true clarity lies. Because from that place you can decide, not from fear, not from longing, but from truth, whether this person has a place in your future. Sometimes the answer will be yes. Sometimes an avoidant will do the work. They'll face their fear. They'll learn to lean into intimacy instead of running from it. And if that happens, it can lead to a stronger, deeper relationship than before. But many times the answer will be no. They'll chase, they'll panic, but they won't truly change. And that's where your courage comes in. Because you have to be willing to walk away from attention that doesn't come with commitment, from pursuit that doesn't evolve into presence. And here's the liberating truth. You don't lose anything by walking away from inconsistency. You gain everything, your time, your energy, your peace, your future. Because your life isn't meant to be spent waiting for someone to decide if you're worth the risk of intimacy. Your life is meant to be lived fully, boldly, unapologetically, with people who see your worth without having to lose you first. So if you take nothing else from this, take this. Their chase is not your finish line. It's just information. Information about where they are, about what they fear, about what they value. Your finish line is your clarity, your strength, your ability to stand in your truth and say, I will not settle for temporary attention when I deserve lasting love. Here's the reflection I'll leave you with. The moment you realize that being chosen once isn't enough, that you deserve to be chosen every single day, is the moment you stop waiting to be chased and start waiting to be met.